Welcome back to Dentro la Storia, the channel for those who love contemporary history. We've reached the second to last episode of our mini-series for this month of April 2026, a mini-series that Giovanni and I decided to dedicate to the liberation of Italy. Today we're at the second to last episode, an episode that covers the final phase of Mussolini's story, his escape from Milan to Dongo, and its conclusion. Today we'll talk about this. Make yourselves comfortable. If you want, prepare breakfast or popcorn, depending on your eating habits, and follow along with us carefully. The end of Benito Mussolini's story is one of the most intense and controversial episodes in 20th century Italian history, not only for its immediate historical and political value, but also for the complexity of what happened, the interpretations, and the interconnections that resulted from it. Historiography has reconstructed with increasing precision the sequence of events between April 25 and April 28, 1945. But it continues to question some motivations, responsibilities, the meanings of that escape, and the conclusion, which we know was extremely violent. To understand what happened, we need to go back a few days earlier, to April 18, 1945, when the German defeat was already clear to everyone. Precisely hoping for a rally from his own men, but also for the possibility of negotiating a conditional surrender agreement, Mussolini had left the headquarters at Palazzo Feltrinelli in Garniato on Lake Garda and had moved to Milan, staying at the prefecture. He had discussed with his men, with his ministers, the possibility of creating a stronghold in Valtellina, a sort of copy of the Alpenfestung project. In reality, as we have already seen in an outdoor video that you can find on the channel, it was little more than an idea, and quite a bizarre one, from the Nazis. On April 22, 1945, in the courtyard of the prefecture, Mussolini gives his last speech to about 100 officers of the Italian Social Republic. The conclusion of the speech, according to witnesses, is in these words: "If the homeland is lost, it is useless to live." But these are mere platitudes, words said to deceive those officers into fighting until the end. In reality, Mussolini is already negotiating. On the evening of April 22nd, he actually meets Carlo Silvestri, who gives him a very important document. Silvestri is a journalist. He also has contacts with the partisans, and he brings him a statement that Mussolini himself reads, agrees with, asks to be able to reply to, and rewrites, and he gives it to Silvestri, with the task of bringing it to the Executive Committee of the Italian Socialist Party of Proletarian Unity. Mussolini's request within that statement is very simple. Do not hand over the Italian Social Republic to the Italian monarchy, and absolutely do not give it into the hands of the communists. Mussolini still deludes himself that he can negotiate. He doesn't know that the negotiations have already broken down. The Germans themselves, starting with Karl Wolff, have been holding talks with the partisans for weeks. The Germans don't want any more trouble. They just want to go home. The Italian Social Republic is about to collapse. On April 23, Allied troops enter Parma. The telephone lines to Emilia are cut. Cremona and Mantua are also isolated. There's nothing more that can be done now. When will the signal for the uprising come? With the occupation of the factories in Sesto San Giovanni, and with the proclamation of the general uprising read on the radio, surrender or perish, Mussolini accepts the last attempt at mediation. It's that of Cardinal Ildefonso Schuster, Archbishop of Milan. Why Schuster? This is a question that historians have always asked. Schuster was a sort of mediator at that time between the Italian Social Republic and the representatives of the National Liberation Committee for Northern Italy. He was an authoritative figure, relatively nonpartisan, a guarantor. Schuster aimed to avoid further bloodshed in a city, Milan, that was now on the verge of armed insurrection. To avoid chaos in the streets, to avoid everyone fighting against everyone, Schuster had attempted one last mediation. From the reports that have emerged from that meeting, Schuster proposed an orderly surrender of the fascist forces to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. However, the guarantees for the safety of the RSI leaders are minimal because, after all, the partisans want a reckoning. They want to settle the score. To use a sports term, they want to close the chapter with Mussolini and his followers once and for all. During that meeting, Mussolini asks for several breaks, officially for health reasons, saying he doesn't feel well, but in reality because the escape is already being prepared. Mussolini doesn't trust anyone, not a single person. Mussolini fears that if that meeting drags on too long, it could become a trap, that he could be held prisoner inside the Curia, where the partisans could easily arrest him. The mediation goes nowhere. Schuster tries passionately, but there's nothing to be done. The delegates of the CLN, led by General Rafael Cadorna, bring only one proposal: unconditional surrender. The fascist loyalists refuse. They ask for an hour to give an answer, leave the Archbishop's palace and return to the prefecture, but they never come back from there. Marcello Petacci, the brother of Claretta, Mussolini's official lover, has already gone to the Spanish consul in Milan, Don Fernando Cantal. He asks him to act as an intermediary as well. The consul agrees, goes to the prefecture, and receives a letter addressed to the British ambassador Norton in Bern, Switzerland. The letter is a proposal, the last proposal. It is to hand over control, therefore the surrender of the Italian Social Republic to the British. In exchange, Mussolini asks, through Marcello Petacci, that fascism not be destroyed, but instead be used as a tool against the communists, against Bolshevism. Mussolini is still convinced, just as some German generals in Berlin are convinced, that it is actually possible to overturn the complex alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union for anti-Bolshevik purposes. Stalin would drop the mask and create a new phase of the conflict. However, none of this happens. The response from the British consul never arrives. The general insurrection is now ready. Mussolini has decided to escape. He says goodbye to some fascist loyalists, greets Rodolfo Graziani, who was his Minister of Defense in the RSI, and flees. He escapes. He's headed for Como. The small convoy is made up of Mussolini, his lover Claretta Petacci, and some hierarchs. A German officer, Friedrich Fritz Berzer, a lieutenant personally assigned by Hitler to escort Mussolini wherever he went. He is his bodyguard. Mussolini's idea is to head towards Como, reach the city, then try to force his way through the Chiasso border crossing and cross into Switzerland, and then surrender. According to the testimony of Renato Celio, who at the time was the prefect of Como, Mussolini had ordered a shelter to be prepared in the city, to wait and see what the Allies would do. Traveling with Mussolini is also Alessandro Pavolini. He is the only and last supporter of the so-called Republican Alpine stronghold, but nobody believes in it. No one really has the will to try to barricade themselves in Valtellina, which in any case is not considered defensible. There aren't enough men, there aren't enough resources. Mussolini has already decided that if the Allies are not willing to save his life, the only escape route is Switzerland. The problem is that the escape is not organized. During the journey, the last vehicle of the convoy, which is carrying several valuables as well as important documents, breaks down in Garbonite. Despite Benito Mussolini ordering the recovery of the material inside the van, in the end, the crew abandons it after saving what they can. In the evening, Benito Mussolini arrives at the Como prefecture. His wife Racheli and two of his children, Romano and Anna Maria, are also in the city, but Mussolini refuses to see them. Meanwhile, Rodolfo Graziani suggests returning to Milan. He thinks it would be more prudent to face the uprising head-on rather than stay in a city as militarily indefensible as Como. In the meantime, in Milan, the uprising has already begun. The Corriere della Sera runs the news of the general uprising on its front page, but it also reports another story. Mussolini is no longer in the city. He has fled. Returning to Milan at that moment could be a big risk. While discussions continue, meetings about what to do, where to go, what actions to take, and which decisions to make, in the end, many of the officials present say that the best way is to head toward Lugano, to go to Switzerland. There are no other options. While they are stalling in the town of Grandola, two people arrive. One is Vezzalini, the fascist party chief of the province of Novara, and the other is Major Otto Kingsknacht of the Waffen-SS, officially a direct superior of Lieutenant Berzer. Kingsknacht comes from Lake Garda. He has abandoned his positions, and he is making his men retreat, heading straight towards Switzerland. News also arrives that, while trying to force their way through customs to cross into Switzerland, ministers Guido Buffarini Guidi and Angelo Tarci were arrested along with the deputy commissioner of the prefecture of Como Salita. The road to Switzerland is blocked at Como, you can't get through. At that point, the convoy decides to merge. Another German convoy in retreat arrives at Menaggio. There are about 38 vehicles, including Kübelwagens and trucks. They have about 200 soldiers, all belonging to the anti-aircraft unit. The command is under Lieutenant Willy Flaminger. They want to go to Murano through the Stelvio Pass. It's not an easy road, but at that point it's also the only road still open to go towards Germany, since Switzerland is blocked. The column moves on. They also encounter some checkpoints set up by the partisans, but up to that moment the partisans have orders to let them pass. The Germans, unless they want to fight, if they want to return to their homeland, everything is fine. It is at that moment that Mussolini, on the advice of the head of his escort, Lieutenant Berzer, puts on a Wehrmacht corporal's coat and a helmet. He pretends to be drunk and gets on a truck number 34 in the convoy. He doesn't sit on the flatbed like everyone else. He hides. He goes to the back, near the driver's cabin, covers himself with a military blanket, pretends to be drunk, acting like he can't wait to go home, until 4 p.m. on April 27th. Everything is fine. What happens at that time? The convoy arrives in the square at Dongo and is stopped there. The partisans get on board the vehicles. According to historical accounts, a partisan named Giuseppe Negri gets on truck number 34, and he has no doubts. That fake drunk, that burly man under the blanket, wearing a coat and a German helmet. It's Mussolini. Comrades rush to the truck and make all the Germans get off. Then they remove the blanket, and I say to him, "You are Benito Mussolini, and you are under arrest." They search him. They find a Glisenti pistol and a submachine gun on him, which are quickly taken away. Mussolini remains silent. He is taken off the truck and handed over to the deputy brigade commissioner, Urbano Lazzaro, whose nom de guerre was Bill, who escorts him to the municipal headquarters of Dongo, where Mussolini's documents are confiscated.
Conservati in una borsa militare.
Other members of the column, other fascists who had joined the column, try to escape. Pietro Corridori and Pavolini, for example, try to escape by throwing themselves into the lake, but their escape lasts only a short time. The partisans fire into the water. Pavolini is grazed by a bullet. He and Corridori are immediately caught again, recaptured and taken, handcuffed like the others, to the holding cells. In addition to these, Marcello Petacci, Claretta's brother, is arrested. He is found in an Alfa Romeo with a Spanish license plate and a Spanish flag on the front fender. Among other things, Petacci has a fake Spanish diplomatic passport with him. He tries to pass himself off as a consul, claiming he has nothing to do with it. His sister, Claretta, also has a Spanish passport. The name on it is Donna Carmen Sanz Baltes. But both of them slip up badly, because one of the partisans knows Castilian very well and exposes them. At first, he thinks that Petacci is Vittorio Mussolini, Mussolini's son. He demands immediate execution by firing squad. Deputy Commissioner Lazzaro, whose code name is Bill, the one who took Mussolini into custody, suspends the summary execution and verifies the identity of Petacci's brother. From that moment on, while the group is held in a specially prepared cell in Milan, there is discussion about what to do. What should be done with Mussolini? Bring him to Milan? Put him on public trial? The Insurrection Committee, which is made up of Pertini, Valiani, Serini, and Longo, meets at 11 p.m. on April 27. They decide to send a mission to Como to carry out the execution of Mussolini. No public trial. They fear that General Rafael Cadorna, torn between his duties as commander of the Volunteer Corps for Freedom and as a liaison with the Allied mission, might intervene, might even request or order that the prisoner be handed over to him to be delivered to the Anglo-Americans. The partisans, they don't want any kind of interference in this matter. And this is where Walter Audizio, whose nom de guerre is Colonel Valerio, comes into play. He is an officer assigned to the General Command of the Volunteer Corps for Freedom. It is to him, Aldo Lampredi, who is a trusted man of Luigi Longo, that the task of carrying out the death sentence is entrusted. At that point, Raffaele Cadorna is up against the wall. he realizes he has no way to convince the partisans to give up their plan. Colonel Valerio sets out. Does he really set out? He has with him a safe conduct pass, signed by Rafael Cadorna himself. In the end, even though they encounter American soldiers from the 34th U.S. Division along the way, the partisans reach their destination, talk to their comrades, and deliver the orders from the Milan Executive Committee to kill. According to the official version, Mussolini is taken to a driveway in front of a villa in Giulino di Tremezzina in Mezzagra for the execution. It is 7 a.m. on April 28th. Colonel Valerio and his companion Guido take custody of Mussolini. At 12:15, they look for a truck for transportation. After all, Mussolini cannot be taken on foot to the place of execution. They load him, take him there, and line him up against the wall. With them is a platoon. There are about 14 partisans. That's a lot. At 15, Walter Audizio, Colonel Valerio, orders Pedro, another partisan, to go and take charge of the other prisoners, not just Mussolini. The idea is to carry out the death sentence by firing squad. Here, the accounts of what happened differ depending on the various testimonies. There is the testimony of Walter Audizio, but there is also the testimony of others who were present at the execution. For example, it is said that at the last moment, Claretta Petacci, who had not been lined up against the wall with the other condemned prisoners, ran away from her captors and threw herself onto Mussolini while the deadly burst of gunfire started. Did it happen like that, or did it not happen like that? We don't know. What is known is that it was Valerio himself who pushed Mussolini toward the railing, past the wall, and spoke these words: "By order of the General Command of the Corps of Volunteers for Freedom, I am charged with bringing justice to the Italian people." On that occasion, Valerio ordered that Petacci be separated from Mussolini, and Petacci understood what was happening. She had clung to her lover, but she was torn away from him. A first attempt to carry out the execution fails. The submachine gun jams, and even Lampredi's pistol jams. A third partisan, Moretti, arrives and hands his submachine gun to Colonel Valerio, who this time manages to fire. It's a burst of 5 shots, and here we return to the episode of Petacci, who is said to have placed herself in the line of fire, being hit and killed as she tried to escape from the partisan who was holding her. Other versions, however, insist that Petacci never moved away from Mussolini, never agreed to abandon him, and stayed with him until the very end, embracing him and fully aware of the risk of dying. It is 4:10 p.m. on April 28, 1945. Mussolini has reached his final act. He is dead, and shortly after, other leaders are executed along with him. On April 29, 1945, the news of the deaths of Petacci and Mussolini spreads throughout Italy and even reaches Germany. In Berlin, in the Chancellery bunker, Hitler reads with horror what has happened. When he is informed of the death of his old friend, and also of what happens afterward, that is, the transport of the bodies to Milan. The decision to hang them upside down at the gas station in Piazzale Loreto, where not long before the Black Brigades had massacred some citizens, some partisans. All this provokes a feeling of horror in Hitler, who gives precise orders, changes his will to instruct his subordinates to cremate his own body, and that of Eva Braun. Emotions are running high throughout Italy, but the versions of the facts, Michel Moretti's version, Walter Audizio's version, and the versions of the other partisans, continue to differ. In various moments, in different situations, it's clear that no one wants to knowingly admit to having shot a woman. The emotion of bringing the bodies back to Milan is felt by almost everyone. They want to show the Italians that the nightmare of fascism is truly over. The other leaders, even though not all of them were actual leaders, had already been selected by Colonel Valerio for execution. Baraccu, Bombacci, Gatti, Liverani, Mezzasoma, Pavellini, Porta, Romano, Untimperge, Zerbino. Along with them, Calistri, Casalinuovi, Coppola, D'Aquano, and Nudi were also executed by firing squad. All of them were executed by firing squad and all brought to Milan. Along with them, Marcello Petacci, Claretta's brother, was also executed. The reason? Spy. Being found in possession of forged diplomatic documents makes him an enemy spy, and therefore There can be no mercy. When the column of partisans arrives in Milan at Piazzale Loreto, the symbolic value of that place is already felt. The massacre of August 10, 1944, carried out by the soldiers of the Muti Brigade, it had not been forgotten by the people of Milan. There are 18 bodies that are hoisted onto the roof of the gas station. Claretta Petacci is also there. The crowd is enraged. The front rows of the crowd, for example, want to trample the bodies before they are hoisted up. The insults, the jeers, and the spitting are beyond counting. A woman even pulls out a revolver, a German Luger taken from a German soldier, and fires 5 shots at Mussolini's corpse. She wants to avenge her 5 children who died in the war. This shows how much Italians really couldn't stand Mussolini, fascism, the Italian Social Republic, and the conflict anymore. This is the end of fascism. It's a violent, brutal end, a fate perhaps even more tragic than anyone could have ever imagined. The analysis of Mussolini's escape from Milan to Como and then of his death. It highlights the complexity of an event in which many dimensions intertwine: the military, the political, and even the symbolic. Cardinal Schuster had tried until the very end, but he hadn't succeeded in his attempt to keep both sides happy, as the saying goes. The escape had turned out to be chaotic, organized only up to a certain point, tragicomic and impossible after the arrests at the customs house. The capture had once again highlighted the pathetic version of Mussolini, who was no longer the arrogant leader who used to appear at Palazzo Venezia to address the crowd. He was now a person completely devoid of any hope. The execution without trial represents the final stage of a rapid but highly significant process. Contemporary historiography tends to interpret this rapid course of events in just a few days. Think about it. From April 22 to 28, 1945, within the context of a sort of crisis of an Italian microstate, the Italian Social Republic, during the War of Liberation, avoiding moralistic simplifications and trying to understand the logic of the actors involved. Why did the CLNAI decide to intervene in such a direct, rapid, and even harsh way, immediately ordering the execution of the prisoners without a trial? It wasn't the risk of escape. They feared that the situation could get out of the partisans' control. They feared that other authorities might take over and try to save Mussolini. That was the concern. Probably the very letters that Mussolini had written, for example to Consul Nathan, had ended up in the hands of the partisans, and they feared that the British might really intervene. Not only that, the Germans' decision to take the road to the Stelvio Pass, knowing that there would be no chance of escape anyway, and to accept Mussolini into their convoy, can be seen from one perspective: as the last attempt to obey an impossible order that came from Germany, from Berlin, from Hitler himself. And on the other hand, as the last favor done for a dictator who was now completely powerless, desperate, searching for an impossible way out. The end of Mussolini is not just a historical event. It is a knot within our national memory. It is a knot that cannot be untied. It's a bit like the Gordian knot, which in this case doesn't require the help or arrival of Alexander the Great, riding Bucephalus, ready to draw his sword and cut the knot in one stroke. It's a knot to keep in mind. You know the knots you tie in a handkerchief to remember something important? That's it. Exactly that. We also need to remember Mussolini's escape and his death at Giuliano di Mezzegra to understand the full absurdity of a dictatorship that presented itself as the saving movement for an Italy that only needed peace. And in the end, it had brought the country into such a destructive war that the expenses, the mourning, the material costs of reconstruction, but also the moral ones, had been paid up to that point by everyone except the direct perpetrators. The harsh and chaotic reaction of the people of Milan in front of the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, the other leaders, and the others who died at Giuliano di Mezzegra makes us understand in a deeply human way what the spirit of ordinary people of that time was. People who were exasperated. They couldn't take it anymore. The hunger, the hardships, the bombings, the violence, the deaths, the torture, they couldn't take it anymore and had blamed all of it on a single figure. That figure who just a few years earlier had been praised, had been carried in triumph. It had been reinforced with slogans, even rather silly ones, along the streets, in the squares, in the newspapers. And that on that spring morning in Milan had been reduced to almost nothing, to a puppet, now lifeless, to an empty shell, which represented in its tragedy, in its human weakness, all the contradictions of a regime as violent in its methods and words as it was inconsistent and foolish in its true nature. This is how the story of Benito Mussolini ends. This is how the story of the Italian Social Republic ends. This is how the War of Liberation ends. But our mini-series does not end here. There is still one more episode. There is still one more installment, a very special episode that we have prepared for Sunday, April 26th. I'll see you then to wrap up this month's mini-series.